Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm really honoured, super delighted to be speaking with somebody who I think is one of the world's leading authorities on sports performance, Professor Mark Williams. Mark, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Yeah, my pleasure, Dan. Great to be on your show.
Well, thank you so much for giving up some time and coming on. I'm really, really grateful. And I'm super excited to talk to you today because you've got a new book out called The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made. So we're going to spend the next hour or so breaking down some of the principles and theories and key concepts that you've written about in that book. But before we get started, there will actually be some people, I don't know who they are, Mark, but there's probably be some coaches out there who don't know who you are. So for those people, could you possibly give us a short sort of potted biography of who you are, your career, and bring us up to speed with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I did a sports science degree back in the 1980s, actually, probably one of the first ever graduates in sports science in the UK, back when there was only a handful of universities that did sports science as an undergraduate degree. Now, of course, it's the most popular undergraduate degree, certainly in the UK. I then did a PhD at the University of Liverpool in movement science with a particular focus on perceptual cognitive expertise, development, anticipation, decision-making skill. And then I guess I've worked at various academic institutions, University of Liverpool. I was at Liverpool John Moores University for almost 20 years. And I guess that's the longest period of time that I've spent in one place. And then after that, I've worked at University of Sydney, Brunel University London. Had a couple of years at Florida State, although I was on secondment there, down in Tallahassee, Florida, with Anders Ericsson, actually. And then for the last 4 years, I've been a professor and chair of a department at the University of Utah, Salt Lake City. And I live up in the ski resort of Park City, which is about half an hour away. And I do split my time a fair bit between the US and the UK. And I've been here in the UK, actually, since the end of March in lockdown.
A real global feel to your experiences, Mark. And this book that you've recently released, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, it feels like, because you've written... I think it's 18 books. I think they're principally academic books, aren't they? You've written over 500 research papers, so quite a prolific writer. And it feels like this book is a sort of a summary of a lot of work that's come before, a lot of the research you've done over the past 30 odd years. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it would, to be honest, Dan. I mean, the book has been a long time in the making, I guess. And as you said, I've published widely in the academic format and written unedited a number of academic books. But this is my first venture into the popular science domain. And I think the idea has probably been in my mind for the last 3 or 4 years, following on, I guess, from some of the other popular science books that others have written over the last few years, like some of Malcolm Gladwell's books and Matthew Said's books. And of course, Anders Ericsson wrote a book a few years ago as well. So I've always been tempted and keen to write a book on my own. So probably this project started off about 2 or 3 years ago, more specifically. And I think I actually approached Matthew Said to ask if he'd be interested in writing the book with me, but he was too busy with various other commitments. So he suggested that I approached Tim Wigmore. Tim is my co-author on the book. He's a journalist for the Daily Telegraph. So he and I have worked on this book for about 18 months to 2 years. And I really enjoyed the experience, to be honest. The reason why I got Tim involved is that whilst, as you said, I have a huge amount of writing experience. I mean, most of it is either to an academic audience or, of course, to coaches. I mean, I've done a lot of coach education-related work as well. But I think the broad perception was that the writing was a little bit too academic. So hence why it was suggested that I get a journalist involved. I'm actually very pleased with the way it's turned out. There's a nice balance in the book in that it's true to the science. I don't think you can say that about a lot of popular science books. But I hope most readers will find it entertaining as well. And I thank Tim for that, because he's done exceptionally well in getting hold of, some really top athletes. So there are probably between 50 and 100 original interviews here that Tim has done with, some of the top athletes in the world, like Marcus Rashford, Pete Sampras, Steph Curry, Ian Poulter, and a whole range of others. So I hope that it's a nice blend between an entertaining journalistic style of writing coupled with authentic and genuine science.
I think for me, Mark, in many respects, it's the book a lot of us have been waiting for. You've mentioned a few things there. I think one of the biggest challenges in this domain is writing something that actually emphasizes the nuance. I mean, this is about how elite athletes are made, and there's enormous nuance there. Elite athletes are made and make themselves in different ways. And so I know myself, having written 4 books and dealing with publishers, that one of the challenges is that publishers like to come in from a certain angle, and that's really, really challenging when you have to appreciate the science, and you have to appreciate that there's lots of different angles. So I love the fact that we're going to talk today about those nuances. But also, as you say, Tim, your co-author there, has helped you to bring the science alive through those the real-world examples, the anecdotes, and just meshed the science and the real world together fantastically well. It's such a good read. So thank you so much, because I know a lot of us were waiting for something like this. I think it's brilliant.
Well, I'm glad you really liked the book. That was the intention, I guess. And actually, with respect to the publishers, they had very little input into the material that went into the book. So editorial control was very light, really. So Tim and I were able to pretty much put pen to paper on whatever we felt comfortable with. I mean, our classical approach, to be honest, was I would write sort of, between 3,000 and 5,000 words of science around a particular topic. And then Tim would begin to write a narrative around it. And then obviously we'd try and work together and go back and forth on it to make those things come together as best as we possibly can. But I guess, I mean, I always as I said to you before, I do a lot of coach education work. And I guess one of the difficulties is that I always say that coaches think in black and white and scientists think in shades of grey. And of course, whether you're a coach or whether you're a journalist or someone who writes popular books, it's easier to sell books, I guess, if you go for the clear, unambiguous storyline. But there's a little bit of a semblance of a little knowledge is dangerous in that regard, because science is rarely black and white, in the sense that it is very grey, and I think we've tried to be true to that throughout the book, in the sense that I think we're going to move on to talk about possibly specialisation versus diversification, but that is one of those topics that there isn't a clear and ambiguous answer to. And as we suggest in the book, the answer to it in terms of whether you should specialise or diversify, I mean, really the answer, it really depends. It depends on a range of factors. And I guess in that chapter in the book and in other chapters in the book, we've tried to do that, not to go overboard on the conclusions, but try and present, I think, what we think is the best state of the science at the moment around those particular topics in the book.
Well, let's hone in on some of those topics. There's 3 parts to the book. Part 1 really revolves around the classic sort of nature-nurture topics and debate. Part 2, inside the mind of a champion. Part 3, training smarter, the science of success. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's take that controversial nature-nurture and all the controversial huge topics within the nature-nurture side of developing elite athletes. You actually start with a really, really interesting topic. You called it the little sibling effect, and that the vast majority of elite athletes have older siblings. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some fairly compelling data across a number of sports and a number of different countries that suggests that your chances of becoming an elite athlete are higher if you have older siblings, and even if you have siblings at all for that matter. And I guess the advantage if you're a younger sibling is that often your older sibling might introduce you to the sport. You know, you get to play with older brothers and older sisters. They provide some guidance, whilst at the same time a very stimulating and rewarding learning environment. And I guess it's a little bit like street sport at its best, isn't it? You probably, as a younger sibling, you plunge into a situation where if you want to be invited back the following week to play with your brother and sister and their friends, then you better perform and do well in that environment. So that mentorship, that guidance of older siblings is important. Also, the older siblings introduce the younger siblings to the sport. The older sibling has probably already been involved in the sport for a couple of years. The parents, the guardians of the kids obviously know that sport a little bit more so because of the experiences that they've had with the older child. And maybe a key thing in the first part of the book is that we highlight the fact really that there's a huge amount of serendipity around becoming an elite athlete. Things that we have very little control over, as per, for example, the role of parents and the role of siblings in that process. Other things covered in the section, of course, relate to where you're born and when you're born, and where you spend your childhood years, things that in essence that we have relatively little control over, but at the same time have such a huge impact on our chances of becoming an elite athlete.
It's really interesting, Mark, because it made me think of when I was working at Queen's Park Rangers Soccer Club in West London. I had the pleasure of working with there's three brothers, the Gallen brothers, who were heavily involved in QPR as young players and coaches, but it was the very youngest one of the three who made it essentially as an elite soccer player, who actually played in the Premier League for QPR and had quite a good career. And talking with him, he spoke about the challenge of competing against his older brothers, how he would have to, they would outmuscle him, how he'd have to think his way through it, learn to react and anticipate quickly. And interestingly, Mark, in terms of location, this all took place. They lived in Acton, right near the ground. They'd literally see the floodlights as they were practicing and playing together. So all that sort of comes together neatly. And it was the younger brother who was the one who went on and made it. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and I think the data is something like on average elite athletes have 1.04 or 04 older siblings, while non-elite athletes have 0.6 older siblings. So there's a subtle difference there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't make it, of course, if you're an older sibling, but statistically, you've got a higher chance of becoming an elite athlete if you're a younger sibling. So so that has quite a substantive impact. So one of those important serendipity issues.
The next hot potato you talk about is parental involvement, which is obviously massive nowadays in terms of the best way for a parent to be involved. And you and Tim Tim's spoken to Judy Murray, I think, or at least gotten hold of some extract.
Tim managed to speak to Judy and to
Jamie.
Jamie, sorry, yes. We couldn't manage to get Andy, unfortunately, but Jamie and Judy gave it a lot of useful time to Tim, and he said they were great to interview, very helpful. In fact, I think he went back to both on a couple of occasions. Both were very generous in giving their time.
What's really fascinating here is, Judy Murray, I think, has always been known as somebody who has been quite a hands-on parent in terms of her involvement with her son's tennis. Obviously, she's a tennis coach. But what's interesting is in the book, you describe how Judy is heavily involved, but isn't a helicopter parent in as much as she gets that balance between involvement and being an autonomy supportive parent.
I mean, yes, parents or guardians obviously play a huge role, particularly in getting kids involved in a sport in the first instance. I mean, it's often that parents drive that initial interest in sport. They obviously take their kids to the relevant training session. And sometimes, of course, that involves a huge outlay of time and resource for parents. They have to drive considerable distances, particularly if it's a specialist sport. And there may be quite considerable cost involved. So, they play a big part. And then, of course, there's the ongoing relationship that the child has with the parents in terms of the extent to which the parents are very hands-on or hands-off in the development process. And clearly there's a balance there between providing appropriate levels of parental support, whilst at the same time ensuring that the child has the opportunity to grow and develop skills of their own. And probably Judy is not the usual parent in that regard, because obviously she was massively involved in sport in Scotland, and not only did she develop her own kids, but she was obviously very instrumental in developing a lot of good tennis players in Scotland. But she was very hands-off as well with the boys, and I think there's some nice anecdotes in the book of how she ensured that she wasn't there to solve all their problems, and that in essence she was there to provide support and guidance, but at the same time she was very careful not to be engaged in too much helicopter piloting, and to allow them to become as independent as they could and solve their own problems. And I think that's a very difficult but yet a very important balance for parents in terms of the development of their kids.
She spoke about the importance of asking questions and having Jamie and Andy brainstorm solutions to the specific challenges that they faced. But obviously they engaged in many hours. I mean, she was the coach and the chauffeur, and she chauffeured them around, and they engaged in many hours of training, of practice. And within this part, you talk about the 10,000 hour rule, if I'm going to use that term rule appropriately, and also early specialisation. So I'd love to get your viewpoint, because these are massive topics. 10,000 hours and early specialisation. What's your thoughts on these? What does the research actually say about them?
Well, the research is very mixed. It doesn't really give clear and definitive answers. And I think the specific answer to the question really depends on so many different factors. And of course, the 10,000 hour rule was never actually intended as a rule. It was more of a guideline in the sense that it was certainly in some of the early research that it seemed that 10,000 hours of practice and 10 years of engagement seemed to come up quite often in terms of the path to performance excellence. But, of course, at the end of the day, the actual number of hours and the actual number of years of engagement really depend to a large extent on the sport itself and the nature of the sport, to what extent success in the sport is determined more so by physical and physiological factors relative to technical, tactical, psychological issues. That plays a big part. The cultural popularity of the sport is important, and clearly the sort of the age of first engagement in the sport clearly is important, and the opportunities that arise there as well. And I guess we interviewed a lot of people in the book, and we interviewed Helen Glover, who obviously won several medals at major tournaments for rowing, and she was probably the prime example of someone who came into the sport late. She was recruited through UK Sports Tall and Talented program into the sport of rowing relatively late on, and then by the time she won an Olympic medal, she probably accumulated around 4,000 hours in the sport. So, but then if you think about rowing in that regard, then it's a sport that's probably heavily dependent on physical and physiological attributes. And it's a sport which probably isn't one of the most popular sports in the world. So perhaps late engagement is more the norm. And of course, she had access to, great support from UK Sport through their coaches and their sports science practitioners prior to winning Olympic gold for those 4,000 hours. And then you can obviously follow other examples. Pete Sampras, we mentioned in the book, Marcus Rashford. These are guys who tended to at least engage early in the sport. Most football players start playing around 4 or 5 years of age, maybe even younger. And skiers as well. Some of the skiers start at 2 and 3 years of age. Whilst they do continue to sample in other sports, clearly football or skiing is the main sport, and they accumulate and continue to accumulate large amounts of practice in that. And then by the time they get to maybe 16, 17 years of age, they've accumulated certainly in excess of 5,000 hours, maybe not 10,000 hours, although probably by the time they make the first team in football, it probably is 10,000 hours. And there are some other sports, of course, where people specialize very early. Gymnastics, for instance, they accumulate almost 20,000 hours of practice before they're in the position to be winning Olympic golds. So certainly in the literature there are different biographic or pathways to excellence that are described, and so there probably isn't a one-size-fits-all model that suits all sports. But I do think that the nature of the sport, its cultural popularity, and the extent to which early or late specialization is the norm are key factors. One other point, I think, a couple of other points that I think are worth raising as well, actually, in that, a lot of people, I guess, are against early specialization. And there is evidence to suggest that early specialization is more likely to lead to burnout, overuse injuries. The fact that you specialize in a sport early doesn't mean that you will continue to have interest and passion in that sport into your later years, and you may potentially miss opportunities to find your one true love, so to speak, in terms of a sport at some stage in development. But then at the same time, some people find their one true love very early and really don't want to play other sports. It's football or golf or tennis or whatever the sport is that attracts their interest, and that's what they want to do. And I guess the challenge with sports which are very heavily dependent on technical and tactical skill, which are culturally very popular and where early specialization is the norm, is that if you don't at least engage in that sport early, if not necessarily specialize in it, then the problem is that you may end up with quite a substantive practice deficit midpoint in development. If I think of football, for instance, and compare the UK and the US, UK players, they start playing 3 or 4 years of age. They often join the academies at 6 years of age. By the time they reach 9, they may have accumulated around 3,000 hours of practice in football. Whereas in contrast in the US, the culture is much more towards diversity during development. And maybe the equivalent 9-year-old player who's shown some interest and aptitude in soccer early in development might have accumulated 1,500 hours in football by the age of 9. So that 1,500 hours of difference in practice, can make have a huge impact on the skills of that ability. So the skills of the player, the game reading skills, the technical and tactical ability. So yes, the nature of the sport plays a big part in it, and there isn't a definitive answer to that. And whilst in essence people from both sides of the camp, both specialization and diversification, might argue strongly for either perspective, I think there are lots of nuances here, and it's very, very hard actually to come up with any definitive conclusions.
it's an interesting landscape, Mark, because obviously, I mean, the context of today is your book, and your book is about how elite athletes are made, or how they make themselves. And what I find, certainly on social media, is a lot of the debate tends to be quite binary around the coaches and the people involved in sport who look at sporting development from what you might describe as a psychosocial perspective, which is putting the child's need at the heart of sports participation, and that tension with possibly the other side, which is, well, how can we maximize the child's experience within sport in terms of developing their skills? And that's where there seems to be a little bit of a tension. Obviously, this book is about developing the elite athlete, but I find that that's where the tension lies at the moment within the sporting landscape.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are moral and ethical issues involved. I guess if it was a perfect world, we'd probably suggest that everybody samples a very wide variety of sports and no one specialises till late on. But obviously it's not a perfect world, and we're in the world of professional sport.
Yeah.
And if you don't at least engage, as opposed to specialise early, then it may be difficult for you to develop the skills at the right stage that are needed to progress. I mean, personally, I'm a strong advocate for the early engagement model, in the sense that it allows you to accumulate enough hours in maybe one or two sports that you're really, really interested in. But at the same time, I would never discourage people from participating in as many other sports as they want. I mean, one of the difficulties we have here as well, I guess, to some degree, is the fact that the empirical evidence, the scientific evidence around what transfers is actually relatively weak, in the sense that, there's a huge amount of intuitive and anecdotal evidence. And we reference some examples in the book. Djokovic says that his ability to be able to slide across the court came about because he spent a lot of time skiing early in development. Ibrahimovic says that his great mobility and his ability to perform overhead kicks comes from his martial arts training. But, that is purely anecdote. I mean, there may be an element of intuition in it, but when you think about the evidence, the empirical evidence around transfer, it's relatively weak. Generally, yes, I would say some transfer occurs, probably early in development and early in your engagement in a sport. But the evidence largely suggests that expertise is very specific to the sport. For instance, some of the technical and tactical skills, ball mastery, ball control, are very different in football to what they are in tennis and in golf. And certainly for me, the evidence in favour of specificity is much stronger than it is in terms of transfer. But ultimately, I guess what we need is more controlled research to empirically address some of those issues. I do get a little bit concerned, actually, where, for instance, some academies suggest that actually compel kids to take part in other sports because they feel that transfer is beneficial. And it makes me a little bit uncomfortable in that regard because the evidence isn't there. I think the role of academies, for instance, is to help develop football skills in kids, and I think that's where they should be focusing their effort. But at the same time, I don't think they should be restricting kids from taking part in other sports if that's what they want to do, but they can do that outside of the academy and at schools.
Just a quick one on that one, because I do want to move on to the next subject, but so if I'm a young footballer and I play rugby, and if we're talking about sports donor skills here, so both sports, rugby and football, for instance, rugby and soccer, a lot of your potential within that sport is the capacity to develop your visual exploratory behaviours, your scanning to be able to anticipate and make effective decisions. So is what I'm saying there. Is there not a lot of evidence that if I'm playing both sports and I'm enjoying the capacity to scan from a rugby perspective, I might not necessarily benefit from a football perspective simply because the rules in rugby are different. It's a different form of scanning. Can it get that specific?
Yeah, I mean, the notion would be is that transfer is more likely to occur the more similar two tasks are.
Yeah.
Whether it's the different elements, technical, tactical aspects, or of course the levels of cognitive processing that are used in the task. So clearly, for instance, futsal and football may be argued to be two different sports, but they have a lot of similarities. So clearly that there seems to be a strong opportunity to transfer there. I mean, rugby and football are obviously very different sports from a technical and tactical perspective. So I guess the interesting question there, what would transfer and how would it transfer? And that really isn't too clear. I mean, it may well be actually that some of the skills that fall more into your domain may transfer in the sense that, aggression, team spirit, self-confidence, mental toughness, grit. Some of those psychological skills may well transfer, but certainly at a technical and tactical level, the two sports are very different. So I would be surprised if the amount of transfer that would occur would be relatively great. I imagine it's quite small. Yeah,
interesting. There's probably people listening to this podcast now shouting at me saying there's much better examples. It's two sports that are more similar than rugby and football. But look, before...
I'll throw one at you. I guess.
Please.
I mean, we have done some work on... empirical work on the ability of players to recognise patterns of play in sports. And we have found, for instance, that field hockey and football have some similar patterns and that actually there is some element of transfer. Now, that is not to suggest there that if you want to be an elite footballer, you should go out and play hockey, but there is some incidental transfer that may be beneficial. So I suppose there is an argument to suggest that if you are going to play other sports, then it would be beneficial to play sports that have some aspects of similarity to some degree.
Interesting. I don't want to leave part one without asking you the big question, because you finished this part on genetics. Do genes matter, essentially? And you quote from biologist Robert Sapolsky, Yannick Pitsiladis, the sports geneticist. So you dive quite deeply into this topic. Question for you, Mark. Nature, nurture, nature and nurture, nurtured nature. Give us a quick answer on the relationship there and what really matters.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. I always try and avoid putting any proportional contribution on these. I mean, ultimately, my view would be is that it's clearly some combination of the two.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe the relative importance of each one may also be sport specific. And our performance in some sports, probably endurance sports, sprinting sports, may be more determined by genetics than it is in maybe sports that are more technical and tactical in nature. I suppose the ethos of the book really is more to do with the fact that in many sports, it may well be that genetics don't set the limit. Or there may be, let's phrase it slightly more positively, perhaps a lot more people have necessary genetics than actually reach the elite level in any one sport. So it may not necessarily be the genetics that therefore set the limits on performance. It's possibly opportunity, serendipity, and the practice environment, and whether players are able to make the right adaptations to practice. I mean, that may also have a genetic component, of course, but there isn't a lot of strong empirical evidence at the moment to highlight the fact conclusively that genes are the determining factor in, for instance, efficiency of changes that occur as a result of practice and learning.
I just to finish off this topic, you mentioned earlier that you had the pleasure of working probably alongside, I'm guessing, Anders Ericsson, who sadly passed away recently. And I love his work and I love his thoughts, his research. And I always remember a few years ago, there was somebody, it was called the Dan Plan. You probably would have seen this. I can't remember his surname, Dan's surname, but he was somebody who decided to give everything up and start training to become a professional golfer in his early 20s. And I always remember Mark, I followed this, and I think in the end he gave up through whether it was burnout or injury or just a lack of progression. He was trying to document a journey of 10,000 hours. And you know what, Mark, as a former professional golfer myself, I mean, he did great. He got down to something like a 3 or 4 handicap, which is really, that's good. That's a very, very good level. It's nowhere near the level you need to be a tour player, but he never quite looked. It's a really fascinating thing, Mark, because, as I say, as somebody with quite a bit of domain-specific knowledge and domain-specific feel for the area as a pro golfer, he never quite looked like a golfer, if that makes any sense. It just wasn't quite there. The way he stood to the ball, the way he went about things. And I just, in summary to this part one, I think it's great because you provide the nuance and the different viewpoints, but there's something about, I don't know, that something wasn't there for this guy, and there's something in amongst the work you've laid out that means it wasn't there for him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, firstly, let me echo your comments. Very sad, of course, for Anders. Hear about Anders' sad passing a few months back. Great man. I loved my conversations with him. He's probably got one of the most brilliant minds that I've come across over the years, and I used to just love to have philosophical debates with him around the data. So very sad that he's passed away. So we'll all miss him greatly in our field and beyond. And the fact that I say that far more people have the necessary genes to reach the level than actually do reach the elite level does not imply, of course, that everyone has the genes to make the elite level. And of course, in the particular example of Dan there that you mentioned, was Dan, wasn't it? Very cool.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Then it's hard to say whether he didn't make it because there were some genetic limits to his performance level, or whether he didn't make it because he didn't get the right exposure to the right practice at the right time to make some of the key adaptations that are needed to reach the elite level. And of course, in many ways, it's very, very hard to tease out those relative contributions. And I suppose to some degree, the plus point about some of the things that we talk about in the book, which is environment, the adaptations that occur as a result of engagement in practice, the importance of deliberate practice, the importance of good quality coaching, are all things that we have a lot more control over. And ultimately, I guess, our individual challenge is to be the best athlete that we can be. And in that regard, I think a lot of the material that's covered in the book helps us to be able to do that. Whereas, we have no control over our genetics. But yeah, it's obviously a fascinating and interesting issue. I think maybe the key thing that comes out of the book is how adaptable the human system is. We, through engagement in the right type of practice and competition activities, the human system adapts, demonstrates great plasticity. And this is, I think, why specificity is important as well, of course, because training needs to match and even exceed the demands of competition so that the human system adapts to those stresses and makes the necessary changes that are needed in order to grow and develop.
Well, talking about adaptability and specificity, I mean, moving on to part two, and I know this is a huge area of research for you. Another book that recently came out that you authored was Anticipation and Decision Making, and that's where part two starts. It's a part about, inside the mind of a champion, but you start with this anticipation and decision-making piece, and a fascinating account of Michael Chang and how he was able to actually get the better of Pete Sampras early, I suppose early maybe in Pete Sampras's career or mid-career, by really detecting the micro movements and the micro habits of Sampras as he was serving that enabled Chang to anticipate and make decisions. It's fascinating. Tell us a little bit about anticipation and decision making in this context.
Yeah, and I guess this one fits into the nature-nurture or the software-hardware debate as well. I mean, I guess if you go back 20, 30 years, there was an argument that still prevails to some degree in popular media that experts are just born with this sort of supervision, this Superman vision, if you like, that they're able to see things that us mere mortals aren't. But actually, when you test the visual function of elite athletes, they rarely do better than their sub-elite counterparts, actually. So it's not the quality of the visual vision per se, but it's to do with the adaptations that occur in memory that lead to the development of these knowledge structures in memory that allows experts to be able to process information much more efficiently and effectively. So rather than having to react to what they see on the field of play, they're obviously able to anticipate. They're able to pick up information from what we call postural cues, from the body shape of an opponent, ahead of, say, ball racket contact in tennis. They're able to identify patterns and structures within evolving sequences of play so that they're able, almost like a supercomputer, if you like, so that they're able to predict what will happen at the end of that pattern of play. And, of course, they use the visual system much more efficiently and effectively. They fixate on different areas of the display. They use peripheral vision better to monitor the positions of teammates. So therefore, the expertise arises through the development of these, what we call perceptual cognitive skills, that enables experts to process information a lot more quickly and efficiently than their less expert counterparts who tend to react to what they see. And of course, this makes it look as if the experts got all the time in the world to make the next decision.
How much, just staying on that genetic element here, because I think this is a really interesting thing right now, because there might be quite a few coaches out there who use an ecological approach, an ecological dynamical approach to their coaching, which very much plays on this notion of the footballer, the athlete, being a detective of visual behaviour, of the micro movements with relation to ball and space. They're looking and essentially then doing based on what they see. But I wonder how much the genetic makeup can influence here, because for me, a coach taking an ecological approach will very much coach a player to pay attention to the right things, get feedback from players in terms of what they're looking at. Why did you look at that? What were you observing? Why did you look in that direction? And base their coaching on that. But can everybody do that? Can everybody see the landscape? Can every quarterback see the landscape like the best quarterbacks can? Can everybody see the landscape like Lionel Messi or Javi Hernandez can? Or is there something genetic there that might influence that? Is there any research on that?
Yeah, no is the short answer. I think it's a great question. We do know that some of these perceptual cognitive skills begin to develop relatively young. I mean, for instance, when we've tested large groups of Premier League footballers, we find that 8-year-old elite players can be differentiated from their 8-year-old sub-elite counterparts based on their so-called game intelligence skill, the ability to anticipate and to make the right decisions at the right time, which may lead you to think, well, there you go, there must be some kind of genetic component to that then. But when we looked at the developmental histories of those players and the age at which they'd first started engagement in the sport and the hours that accumulated in practice, I mean, the elite players had already accumulated 1,000 hours of practice by age 7 or 8, whereas their sub-elite counterparts had only accumulated 300 hours in practice. So clearly there's a big difference also in exposure to the sport, and therefore it's very hard to tease those out. What we do know, of course, is that game intelligence skill does get better with experience and therefore through age. So therefore game intelligence in a 10-year-old is better than an 8-year-old, and turn a 12-year-old is better than a 10-year-old. But what we don't have actually is any longitudinal research. So we actually don't know whether someone who perhaps has outstanding game intelligence for their age at age 8 will also have outstanding game intelligence at age 18. And of course, we know with children that a lot of skills develop in a non-linear rather than a linear fashion. So really, it's very hard to map out the development of skills, and we don't really know that. So we don't know the developmental trajectories of these, and we don't know at all whether there are some genetic factors that may influence, for instance, the relative return on hours engaged in practice in terms of the development of those kinds of skills.
We're talking about experience with relation to anticipation and decision making. There's a wonderful story taken from a baseball hitter called Joey Votto. And Joey Votto talks about when he first started out, that whole cliche of see the ball, react, and then hit the ball. He would say in his early career or in his high school, college career, that applied. But as he started to move, so if the ball was being thrown at him at 75 or 80 miles an hour, great. But when it started moving towards 85 and 90 miles an hour, he realized that he needed to start paying attention to the kind of things that were going to help him anticipate what the ball was going to be doing. And it's very, very interesting. You talk about, I think you take evidence from Mike Hussey, the Australian cricket player, who talks about just not seeing the ball. And Joey Votto talks about not seeing the ball. You don't track the ball. You just see the ball being released in the hand, and then you've got to anticipate based on the bodily cues of what you're seeing. I mean, it's fascinating. But as you're saying, it's that experience over time that enables you maybe to get better at therefore hitting that pitch or hitting the bowl.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence suggests that the ball is moving too fast. If you're facing a Jofra Archer, for instance, the ball is really moving too fast at 90 miles per hour for you to, in essence, watch the ball onto the bat. So clearly the need to pick up information from the bowler's run-up delivery action, as well as, of course, of your likely knowledge of the types of deliveries that he's more or less likely to bowl at different types of the match is important. I mean, you would be able to pick up some information from the early part of ball flight and possibly might be able to make some minor adjustments to bat location up to, say, 100 milliseconds before the ball hits the bat. But yes, you can see that there's a lot of prediction that's needed here, at least to get loosely into the right position to play the right type of shot. And clearly experience and the development of these knowledge structures become very, very important. And even though at times, I guess in the Mike Hussey example, I mean, what happens with top batters, I guess, is that a lot of this information is also intuitive, or what you might call subconscious or tacit. So they don't really know what they do, because obviously they don't focus specifically perhaps on picking up certain cues most of the time. They just make the right decision as to which shot to play at the right time. And maybe they can't always articulate how they do that, but they've obviously learned and made the key adaptations that are necessary. But again, these are adaptations. They're perceptual skills. They're not like these athletes are born with better eyesight or better reflexes than you or I. It's just that clearly they've had a lot of experience, a lot of exposure to dealing with the Jofra Archers of these world, and they've made the necessary adaptations that are needed to give them more time to be able to cope.
Well, that experience, combined with possibly a genetic propensity to some form of athleticism, potentially leads to a super intelligence. And that's a chapter title in part 2. And you actually talk a bit about about Jamie Carragher, the former Liverpool defender's experience of reading the game, and he said it was a real strength of his that he would rather have that capacity to read the game than maybe the athleticism that some players have. He talks about the importance of that and the visual exploratory behaviours, something that I think it's Jourdain, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, I hope I am, does the Norwegian... Yeah, the Norwegian sports psychologist does a lot of research on, and it's. I think this, for me, Mark, is a fascinating landscape. Having spent a lot of time working soccer, this idea of, I think sometimes, whether it's in sports psychology but in coaching, we promote this notion of just do it. Just go on the pitch and just do it. But I do think there's this element of, I mean, the way Jamie Carragher describes it, yes, there's a subconscious going on. I can see it, and I know what I've then got to do. I can anticipate what the next actions have to be. But he's thinking the game. He's looking, he's thinking, he's actually analysing the game very quickly, it feels like, but making decisions based on what he's seen. But he's not just... It feels to me with these athletes, Mark, that they're not just doing it. There's a cognitive process going on, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, back to my previous point on Mike Hussey, I mean, I guess all Jamie Carragher will be doing in essence will be making the right decisions at the right time. But in his mind, of course, he'll be working like a supercomputer. He's processing vast amount of information. Yeah. So he will be picking up information from the body shape of teammates, opponents, the player in possession of the ball. He'll be recognizing evolving patterns and structures of play. He'll know the kinds of passes most likely to be made by the player in possession of the ball. He'll be aware of the types of runs most likely to be made by the strikers. And all of that information he'll be processing in a subconscious manner, which allows him to be able to make some predictions about what's going to happen next, even before it's actually happened. So that therefore, in Carragher's case, he could get by with not being the quickest player on the pitch because his mind was a little bit quicker than everybody else's. So therefore, he could position himself or position the team around him, if you like, because obviously he's a good leader in that regard as well, in terms of communication and motivating the back four. So he could communicate them into the right shape or the structure or reposition himself so that he wouldn't get caught out often by his general lack of pace. I guess to some degree, though, what you'd ideally like to be is fast of mind and fast of foot. And then I guess you'd be worth a lot in the transfer market. But obviously Jamie was not blessed with great pace, but clearly his mind allowed him to compensate for that. And of course he had that great partnership with Sami Hyypiä, who also likewise was not the fleetest of foot, but had good game intelligence. So they were both very canny in their ability to read the game and buy them the time that they needed. But that's a very interesting balance, that, isn't it, in the sense that you can see when players are a bit younger, they may be a bit faster, and then as they get older, obviously their game intelligence and their ability to read the game improves. I suppose, as I said, what we really want is young players with great game intelligence. So there's an interesting question from an applied perspective there. How do we develop game intelligence at an earlier age in players? And how do we, if you like, allow them to have the same knowledge that a Jamie Carragher has, but at a much younger age? And then we're talking about world-class players at that.
Yeah. Just before we get on to part 3, you finished part 2 on a chapter about choking, and you introduced me to a moment, and I've experienced this in my own in my career when I was a pro golfer, when I was trying to qualify for the British Open and played with 2 stellar players, and I completely choked, and I experienced what cricketer Scott Boswell experienced essentially. And you, in the chapter, you invited me to go onto YouTube and watch as this bowler, I think he he ended up delivering 13 or 14 balls in this one over. He had about 4, 5 or 6 wides, and it was a real overt example of choking. So it wasn't nice to watch, but I think we can all learn from it. How do you approach choking in the chapter, Mark? What explanation do you give for it?
Well, we know that anxiety can have negative impacts on performance. In that, for it's done research that shows that when we become anxious or when we become physiologically fatigued, mentally fatigued, then we often change the way we use the visual system to extract information. We change our technique to some degree, and there's this general propensity to reinvest effort into aspects of the movement that had previously become automated. So when we become anxious, for instance, we perhaps think about our bowling action in Scott Boswell's scenario. If you're going to take a penalty kick, you think about how you're going to strike the ball rather than just deciding where you can strike it, so to speak. So there's a lot of research that has looked at how anxiety can have negative impacts. Sometimes, obviously, certainly moderate levels of anxiety can have positive impacts on performance. It's all part of the psychological state of feeling ready for the action, I guess. But, we talk about the importance of self-confidence. We talk about the importance of mental toughness. And, of course, we talk about the importance of training under pressure in the sense that if you're used to practicing under pressure, whether physical or mental, and I guess if you've had previous experiences of being in those types of situations, then I guess you learn to develop some coping mechanisms to try and avoid choking happening in future. So yes, we've got to focus in the book. There's some other examples there of choking, and I guess the reverse effect, which is also clutch states, of people moving into mental states where, they're just performing and they're not really thinking about any aspect of performance, and they're not worrying about what they should be doing and when, which is almost the reverse state of choking. Get into optimal mode of performance. And there's some interesting biographical stories in the book of both of those illustrations in terms of clutch states. I guess I love the story about Ian Poulter. It's probably one of my favourite parts of the book, actually, about the miracle in Medina, and Rory McIlroy talking about Ian Poulter's bulging eyes, and when he gets in that mindset, then he becomes unstoppable. So it's one of my favourite parts of the book, that particular section.
It's extraordinary, and just briefly going back to Scott Boswell, the cricketer, he talks about how he didn't have a routine, how he sped up, how things changed, and so subsequently, as a consequence of his emotion, how he felt, he didn't have a go-to set of habits or framework, mental framework, during that moment. And what was also quite interesting was perhaps his teammates weren't that helpful. It's mentioned in the book, but actually you can see it on YouTube, is that there's nobody actually, or at least the footage that you can see, there's nobody going up to him going, hey, take a breath, slow, even if it's just as simple as take a breath, slow down. And it's something I personally always talk about, and actually we won't talk too much about it today, but you do address in the book shared mental models, and I think there's so much room, as a sports psychologist, I believe there's so much room in our team sports to start to put more emphasis on shared mental models around the mental side of the game.
I mean, I agree with you. I guess to some degree what Boswell needed was you, Dan Abrams, or some kind of applied sports psychology support system in place. I think he was a relatively inexperienced cricketer as well, so he hadn't played at that level too much, which probably didn't help him either. But certainly there's evidence that these kinds of moments are not inevitable, and clearly through adaptations to practice, through the development of the right kind of psychological skills, often through some interventions, then we can make athletes more resilient. for these kinds of incidents of choking.
Let's talk a little bit about development and skill development. Part 3 moves on to training smarter, the science of success. And as a consultant, having worked with a number of clubs, teams, national teams in various sports, I think the quality of practice, in my opinion, is a strong mediator of how far one goes in their sport, especially at the very adult elite level, maybe at the professional level, where there's not a great deal of difference between a lot of the competitors, and so how they practice matters. And you open up this part with our friend Dr. Anders Ericsson and his concept of deliberate practice. Tell us a little bit about deliberate practice. Take us through the steps that Anders introduced to the world.
Sure. Well, deliberate practice is specific, purposeful practice with the intention of improving some aspect of performance. I guess fundamental to Anders' arguments was that experience is not necessarily directly related to performance, in that often what people do is they reach a performance plateau where they just continue to practice the same things in the same way, and that they don't actually specifically develop practice activities that continue to challenge the system and to continue to encourage growth, development. And I mean, we've actually done some empirical work on this again, where we've looked at how elite and sub-elite athletes practice. And interestingly, elite athletes spend more time practicing the skills that they're not good at, whereas in contrast, sub-elite athletes spend more time practicing skills that they are good at. So clearly you can see that the elite athletes really have this growth mindset. They're determined to continue to refine existing skills and to develop new skills. And what they're able to do is to set a higher ceiling for what it is that they're trying to achieve. And then clearly where possible, this would be assisted by some aspect of measurement if you're empirically able to identify what the weaknesses are. And then sometimes the use of a coach may be quite important to work with the athletes to make sure that they develop the right types of training programs. And obviously resilience is important, because if you're always practicing at the challenge point, then you're going to fail a lot. So there's always a very thin balance between success and failure. So the resilience and the mental toughness of the elite athlete in being able to see those failures as an opportunity for growth and development is absolutely crucial. So I think there are a lot of the main tenets that Anders put forward that are quite important in elite sport, so that we can continue to be moving up the learning curve, continue to make the right kind of adaptations that are necessary to reach the very highest levels. And I don't think athletes and coaches necessarily look at practice in that same way. So I think, and we've got some good examples in the book from Steph Curry and one or two other athletes as to, what do they mean by deliberate practice, and how do they engage in those types of processes in keeping with their coaches and support structures.
Well, actually, I think it's brilliantly brought to life with the story of Elena Del Don, who is a basketball player in Washington, arguably one of the best in the world, and her relationship with one of her coaches, Eric Thibault. And if I may, I actually quote from the book now. Elena says, "Now I've gotten older, I know I have to work smarter and realise quantity is not the best recipe, especially for my body. So just trying to be efficient through the workouts and know that today we're going to work mid-range and that's the focus, and we're going to get these shots in, and we're going to do a little bit live, a little bit with no defence, and then some defence. Each day you just go in with an idea of what's the thing we're working on today, and then it helps you get a way more efficient workout." And I think it's fascinating, Mark, because as a consultant, again, I'm gonna come back to British football. What I've found experientially, is that very few players, at least that I've conversed with, come across, watched, trained, and that's quite a few over the last 15 years, very few will go into their training sessions with specific things that they want to work on. Specific things that they're going to stretch themselves on, and very few do what Elena does, which is to sit with Eric and actually work out specifically what they're working on each day, each week, each month. There's a real sense of, well, the name, deliberate, intentional training.
Yeah, and I suppose what it does as well is it highlights the challenges for the coach, doesn't it? I mean, in that football session you're referring to, the coach might have 16 to 20 players that he or she is working with. Obviously, what is one person's deliberate practice is another person's maintenance training. And often the coach is working on the needs of the team rather than the needs of the individual. But I think it does highlight the important issue of the individualized nature of training, in the sense that, and not all training perhaps has to fulfill this criteria, but certainly you need to identify empirically where possible the strengths and weaknesses of a player, and then develop specific practice sessions to try and improve those weaknesses, and then continue to monitor those improvements over time so that you are developing a better player. So, and I believe that maybe in football, the culture is moving towards that. I think there's probably a lot more evidence of individualized training being put into place now than there was a couple of decades ago. But maybe it's got a lot more to go on that journey to get that balance right, to make sure that, in essence, I mean, we'll never get to this point, but ideally what you want is 100% of every practice session to be every athlete's deliberate practice and every athlete's challenge point to grow the system. But clearly that's almost an impossibility. But I guess the more interesting question is, where are we at the moment? What is the efficiency of practice? As you bring those 22 players or so off the pitch at the end of an hour's training, what is the relative rate of improvement of those players? I assure you it's not 100%, and it may be a lot lower than we think it is, but interesting question.
It's a big goal. It's a big goal to have every single player working deliberately and helping them work deliberately, and in a way I suppose that's the question you pose in the next chapter, which is about coaching and what does effective coaching look like in order to optimize player ability. And actually you talk a little bit about a friend of mine, Phil Kenyon, the golf coach, but specifically putting coach, and his work with Justin Rose and how they've tailored his putting practice to be just a little bit more optimal, a little bit more effective, rather than being blocked, which I think Justin was heavily involved in. They've added in a lot more variability. How much do you think the coach can improve the player?
I think coaches play a pivotal role. I mean, clearly there's a lot of opportunities for players to learn independently as well. And one of the chapters in the book, of course, looks at street sport and the importance of street football, for instance, in the development of some of the skills that are important. One of the biggest challenges for coaches, so the coach's role is probably the most difficult role in the world here, really. Not only does he have to fulfill these principles of deliberate practice rather than maintenance training, but also the coach needs to differentiate between performance and learning. So in essence, when you take your players out into the field for that hour training session, what you see is actually not their learning, but their performance. And the reason why the differentiation between performance and learning is important is that different instructional variables influence these things differently. So in order to infer that learning has taken place, you need to see that the change in performance that you see in practice is retained into subsequent practice session and transfers to the match play situation. So in other words, you need measures of retention and transfer in order to evaluate learning. So where this is an issue is that if I want the best performance in a coaching session, then what I would probably do as a coach is provide lots of instruction, do specific block practice of a single skill, and offer lots of feedback, because that produces the best performance in the session. Whereas in contrast, the reverse conditions might promote greater learning, greater retention and transfer of skill. So then the question that I might have will be, well, look, what is the least amount of information that I need to give these athletes so that they can begin to perform the task independently? Secondly, to what extent do my practice conditions match the demands of competition? Does it look like the game? Does it feel like the game? Are the demands physical, psychological the same? And then what is the least amount of instruction that I need to give these players? And ironically, getting that balance right is important for learning. And of course, some of those conditions that I mentioned at the end there that promote learning, like limited instruction, dynamic, realistic match situations, and limited feedback, is what you see in street football. And in essence, what you're doing there is you're putting the onus on the athlete, the player, to learn independently, to become engaged in the process of learning, to own the problem and to try and find solutions to the problem. And it doesn't mean that the role of the coach becomes redundant, far from it. I guess the challenge for the coach is how to act as a facilitator in that process. But rather than be to hub of the process in the sense that I own all the knowledge and I'm going to give it to you and you'll be a better player because of it, it's more a case of how can I create this learning environment? When do I give instruction? When don't I give instruction? How do I manipulate the constraints of the learning environment? And when and how do I provide feedback? That are difficult issues. And the challenge for the coach more than anything, therefore, is that what you see in the coaching session is not necessarily what you get from a retention and transfer of learning perspective. So the coach, therefore, is very intuitive. He or she's shooting in the dark a little bit in terms of getting this balance right. And of course, it highlights the fact that skill learning is very much a long-term process and not a short-term process. And of course, there are times where maybe your focus is on performance. You want good performance in the training session because you're preparing team to play the next day. But I guess mostly the focus is on long-term learning and development. And then the question is, what does that mean in terms of how I structure and deliver these types of coaching sessions?
Something I've experienced working in some quite high performance environments, again, the world of football. There's a game on Saturday, a big game. We train on Thursday, we do walkthroughs, or we do our shape work, our pattern work. I'm taking players through the game model. But historically, I haven't necessarily witnessed any testing for understanding, Mark. So the players are taken through the game model, but there's nothing there. There's no practice. There's no activity that tests whether they can understand that or recreate it under any kind of pressure. I don't know if there's actually a question there. That's just been my experience, and that feels like that's something that could, from my experience, and that is limited, that feels like something that could be improved upon.
Yeah, but we could look at that also as well as a long-term skill development process.
Yeah.
In so much as that. And again, I'm going to talk about football again because it's, I guess, the sport that I'm most comfortable with. But I think the same principles apply across a range of different sports. And ultimately, I guess, if you've got players on that journey from 6 years of age, ideally right the way through the first team, I mean, you know, you're not going to create creative and independent decision makers in a short window.
Sure. So
therefore, what you need to do is you need to create learning environments for them at a young age, so that they're used to a less prescriptive approach to coaching, so that they, used to being an independent, critical thinker around the sport and how to perform the sport and strategic and tactical aspects. And I guess if that's an important part of the curriculum through development, then when they get to adult senior football, then at least you'll have the players with the right skills to adapt and to be independent, where I guess it's very difficult if the players have been brought through a system which is very structured and very prescriptive, for them to adapt to a system that is very different later in development. But it's all in keeping with the argument that look, great athletes, the best players, aren't created overnight. There's a long journey here, and each stage of that journey plays an important part in making sure that those athletes reach the end of that journey, if indeed there is ever an end to the journey.
My final question. In 20 years' time, will we all be putting on virtual reality headsets and learning in that way?
I do think that virtual reality technology has moved forward at pace over the last few years, and there are a number of commercial companies that are now using virtual reality in high-performance sport contexts. A friend of mine once said, well, what's better than virtual reality is reality. And I mean, I think he's right in that regard. So in essence, VR is never going to replace the need for appropriate training sessions in match-specific contexts. But I think some of the advantages of VR is it allows you to control practice environments and to give repeated exposure to athletes of, for instance, a penalty kick situation or a situation that involves decision making in a game situation that they've not dealt with very well. And in VR environments, of course, we can use matches to create first-person viewing perspective of games, so that you're then putting the player back into that environment and that he or she is able to get the opportunity to make that decision under varying situations a number of different times. And there's other things you can do with VR. For instance, you can simulate crowd noise and distractions that provide a training environment. So I think VR will become more prevalent, I'm sure, over the next decade or so. I think the more innovative clubs will explore ways that they can optimize the use of it. And I think it will help support and reinforce training, particularly perhaps in regards to the development of decision-making skills. But, ultimately it's never going to replace the need for physical training in the real world, or of course for match play. But I think it's an important tool in the arsenal. But maybe one final point to note here, though, is that it's not just about the technology. What you need to do is you need to harness the technology along with what I might call appropriate instructional systems design. What type of training programs do you need to develop? How and when do you provide instruction? What type of practice sessions to deliver, and how and when you provide feedback. So in some degree, we need to harness the technology with, the right type of instruction support. And I think coaches can play a big part in that role, but I think people, perhaps like myself, with a background in skill acquisition, can also help in that regard. So the ideal scenario, the holy trilogy, if you like, is to have the technology side to the triangle, then the coach and the practitioners, and then the scientists, making sure that we're developing the most efficient training program. And that might help perhaps move us forward on that problem we discussed before, in the notion that, what we ideally want is a centre-back in football, for instance, with 22-year-old centre-back with the game intelligence of a 28-year-old centre-back. How can we use technology, and how can we use sports science, and of course the right type of coaching practices and instruction to try and develop players that are more game intelligent at an earlier stage, I think is quite a nice challenge moving forward for us.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for this. Your book, The Best How Elite Athletes Are Made, where can people pick up a copy?
I think it's available at most of the big bookstores, and it's on Amazon, and it was published by the Hachette Group. So if you type the best how elite athletes are made into the internet, it'll come up, and it's in hardback, paperback, audiobook, and Kindle format. So each to their own choice.
It's a cracking read. So I think it's, as I said at the beginning, it's one we've all been waiting for. Just mixing the nuance of science and some really entertaining and interesting anecdotal evidence as well. So thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and thanks for inviting me onto your pod. I hope the listeners find it of interest.
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, everyone, that was Professor Mark Williams. That was absolutely superb, and I can't recommend that book enough. I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.